Fan Pile Comic Hour with your hosts, Andrew Glonner
and Chris Ramos.
And tonight we are going to review They Call Us Enemy by George Takei and art by Harmony Becker. And this book actually was kind of something that's been on my radar for a while. And almost just because it's George Takei and what he's done with pop culture, as he is known for being on Star Trek, the original series as Dr. Sulu or Mr. Sulu or Captain Sulu or whatever iteration you want to call it. And he has such reverence for the role and what he pioneered kind of for his culture as part of that. And so
he talks about that often, saying,
yes,
Star Trek was sort of this idealistic future, and that he really hopes that resonates with American culture.
Yeah. Gene Roddenberry was like, that's the whole idea. Yeah. Be more representative of the diversity that's out there. And it was really like Nichelle Nichols, like she was like such a huge pioneer in that manner as well. So that's how they both bonded on that. And we touched upon it in the book, but it was such a huge thing. I should say it was really interesting to see. Like, I thought this was going to be autobiographical, and it is, but and when a book calls this, They Call Us Enemy, you're like, well, okay, let's dive deep more in there. What is that? And it talks about his early life growing up in America during World War II, during the 40s.
And he was born in America.
He was born American. And he's a Japanese. And they call it Japanese American.
Right.
So he was born. His parents were even.
His dad was born in Japan.
His mom was from America.
Yeah. Right.
And it talks about them and his upbringing in internment camps, because as we dig into it, after Pearl Harbor happened and the bombing of that, President Roosevelt.
Right.
Yep. He made a whole declaration saying that anybody of Japanese descent was immediately an alien and enemy of the state. And so they were sent off. Everybody who was of Japanese descent, whether you were from Japan or had parents that were from it, were all sent to internment camps. Kind of similar to over in Europe, where the Jews were sent to internment camps for being Jewish.
Right. I mean, the president called it Executive Order 9066,
yes.
And they passed that in 1942 on February 19th. And that was, it wasn't specifically mentioned that Japanese were to go into camps. Those words were never used, but
right.
it was authorizing the military to move,
to relocate
certain
relocation
segments,
centers.
right?
Maybe that's what they usually.
Yep, and they really targeted the Japanese population, and George was tiny at the time. He was just a young boy.
Yeah, and then he had one brother and one sister as well, and his sister being the youngest.
So it. Again, I was with you. I thought it would be more of an autobiographical sort of this is my life kind of thing, but it turned into George. I think George has a really interesting skew on it. It's like he's proud to be an American right now. He does talk a lot about like LGBTQ rights. He talks about a lot. He has his own podcasts and social media accounts where he's very vocal.
Yes. I mean, he's a pop culture icon.
Yeah, really. And he's really grown a following. And for him, it's just about being fair and being, right and being good to each other. And, they talk about he was named the #1 most influential person on Facebook. He has 10.4 million likes.
I seen that.
Yeah. And it's like,
and obviously this book was published in 2019.
Yeah.
So I mean, still
a good 5 years ago or 6 years ago.
But still, for that being that recent of this book coming out, and for him to have that reverence,
voice. It's
voice.
A voice he has, and it's it does resonate through the book, because the story is told more from his viewpoint.
Yeah.
And
I agree with that.
He's the first one to mention that, he was very young. So he thought they were going like on a
An
vacation or,
yeah.
oh, you know what? We're all together. At least we're all together as a family. We're just going to
Mhm.
move into a different house. And,
Yeah.
it's only later on in life when you realize that, how
The
hard it was
trauma
on
of
your
that.
parents,
Yeah.
right? So he
It's like,
talks about that a little bit where he kind of says, when we were younger, he had an idea that something was wrong, but his parents kept it well hidden, which is,
yes.
sort of the job of parents, I guess,
Right.
sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess from my point of view, I mean, we were never like taught this really in school. And from how I look at it after reading this, I'm like, well, now that it's out, this should be at like a high school to college level. Like people
Right.
should be reading this. And I think otherwise this part of history could easily be skipped over and not given the attention and reverence that George wants to give it.
Yeah. And I really did like how the story started because it started right away talking
Mhm.
about Pearl Harbor as like the catalyst,
Yeah.
and people think Pearl Harbor was the catalyst for us to,
Enter
join the
the
war.
war.
Like that's
Yeah.
it, we're in. And, I think a lot of people saw that as a encouraging, exciting event,
Right,
but
because I guess our history books teach us more of like, this is the patriot.
that was our call.
That was our call
Right.
to action. Absolutely.
And you don't realize that there were lots of groups, many minority groups
Yeah.
that were sort of left in the dust of, uncertainty.
Yes.
You just don't realize how much we're just thrown to the side of like, we'll worry about you later, and
Sure.
I was surprised by the actual number of people that were pushed to the side. I
Yeah.
was like,
There was quite a few.
yes, thousands and thousands and thousands
Right.
of families.
And to do it to people that live within our own country,
yeah,
that was still even mind blowing of that too. I mean, you think, all the hardships we came through during like the Civil War, and we try to be more encompassing of that. I mean, we don't get to the 1960s yet, but still, you think we come a little farther and a little farther, and then you realize, whoa, this happened in our own country.
Yeah.
Like that's still shocking.
You're right. And the single most shocking thing for me was, as Americans, we think we're born here. We're born in America and we're protected, right?
Yeah.
And you can't take that away from us.
Sure.
But in their case, they were born here, and because of events that were happening across the world,
Mm-hmm.
their basic American rights were just up in the air.
Yeah.
And it's like, but we were born here, and they said it doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what really,
because they were
is the
fearful
point.
of that betrayal.
Well,
To see it within their own country.
yeah. And I thought, I think that this podcast is just going to be us just jumping around, getting our thoughts out. But
absolutely.
But there was a part where they wanted the Japanese Americans to, either acknowledge the United States government and then disavow
Their
the emperor,
the emperor
in Japan.
Yeah.
And I thought it was interesting when they said, well, if we disavow the emperor in Japan as Americans,
Mhm.
then you're assuming that we had an allegiance to them in the
the
first place.
Right.
So they're like,
we were never even gotten there.
yeah. So they're like, so if I say, yes, I will disavow the emperor, that's assuming that I have at some point made a vow to the emperor, which I have not.
Right.
And so they were really caught in sort of a catch-22 because if they said, yes, I'll give up my Japanese heritage, then that really still doesn't help them, because then you're saying, aha, you did have a tie to Japan. And that's what they were trying to find out. I wonder if they were ever able to sort of pull anyone that was loyal to Japan,
Sure.
in a way, right? But George's family was pretty much the quintessential like American family of Japanese descent trying to make a new life in America.
Yeah.
I mean, they really had no, they weren't sensational.
Yes.
Like his dad wasn't a soldier.
Right.
It was they were just literally, they were dry cleaners. They owned a dry cleaning business.
That's how they started out.
And,
absolutely.
And that's it. So you do follow sort of the average, average
Japanese American family,
right, in that time.
And during 43 43, 42, somewhere in that period. And it was quite astounding just to see the hardships that they gone through. This was a little bit like reading Maus again, just from a different perspective and a different culture.
Yeah, Maus is on the shelf now, so it's like, right? You're right.
And so it was this deja vu. I mean, we are the art is in black and white. It from, let me get the artist again, Harmony Becker, and she draws it in a very not very much like a manga style or a Japanese style, or I guess not as Americanized as we think of comic art. And it's all in black and white and gray tones and things like that. And so it gives us that serious tone, kind of like Maus. But I think and similarities, we're going through a family's life.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was just like, to have this book come out as recent as like the 2019, I was like, wow, it's at least we're getting more of that history and another perspective and educating about that. So I'm glad he wrote this and shedding some light on these issues. So
yeah, I mean, he had some editorial directors working with him that were just able to turn his stories into a comic book format, because I do want to give a little shout out to that. Every story might not translate into a comic.
Yes.
You have to kind of have a certain pacing and a certain direction. So a lot of times to turn a like a documentary type story into a comic really does take a little finesse, because on one end, you don't want to turn that story into like a cartoon,
Correct.
It's a serious story.
Yeah.
And Maus came under fire a little bit because it was so serious of a story that they had to turn the characters into mice and dogs and cats.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point to differentiate the two, is we didn't do that in this story. These look like real people.
Right. So like, at what level do you need to tell such a serious graphic story that you have to anamorphic into that story? So
I guess this isn't like as graphic as Maus was.
No, it was
but the tone is.
Yeah, and the tone was, but like when I was reading it, so like Maus was talking about genocide and concentration camps and entire Jewish families being mistreated, and they wanted to tell that story in a graphic nature because it was horrific. Right. Now, this story, They Called Us Enemy, is still a very difficult subject for Americans. Yeah. I wonder, and maybe this isn't the popular opinion, but I wonder if this hits differently for Americans as if you were, or Europeans, or Vietnamese, or
absolutely.
I wonder how this story is translated
to like different cultures.
Yeah, like maybe other cultures who do live very close to countries that are always attacking,
right?
And who have seen years of war where America, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, we haven't had much happen on our soil, right? So I wonder if other countries read this and say, you know what, that is a good precaution. And that is something that would have to happen in a war, because you don't know who your enemy is. And, instead of trying to find the enemy, it might be easier just to say we're taking a precaution. So no one was like, I guess I wanted to kind of call out, no one was mistreated in the camps that I saw, like in the book. Like they weren't, killed. I mean,
not as at that severe level.
Yeah,
correct. It was just like their dignity,
right, and their humanity, and their nationality, and all of the stuff that America promises was taken away, right?
Sure.
So, but it wasn't like Maus is a different level.
Yes,
of course,
correct.
So, but this story still needs to be told, because I think the shocking part was this happened in America,
right?
And that is what a lot of people would say should not happen.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we don't want to repeat that either in current events and things like that.
Right. And that's why it's such a good story. And I think it's really held up well. The copy that I have is from Scholastic Books, so it's sold in the schools at the Scholastic Book Fair. And actually, it's a great novel. It's only like 200 pages, and it's in a Scholastic format, so it's not like 8.5 by 11. It's not. It's just a little smaller.
Yeah. And then so that was published by Top Shelf Productions, and also IDW is also coming out with if not, it hasn't already come out. They have a hardcover deluxe edition that's more expanded and has bonus material in that as well.
That'd be good. Yeah, that'd be cool.
That'd be interesting to pick up and look at it and see what else he expands on, or he goes into more detail, or what other content went into making this book. So,
yeah. I mean, I liked too that it was really grounded in an actual person they featured him a little bit in there. Like, it showed him during a TED Talk.
Oh, right. So it does happen at some points where George is telling us from what we perceive as like current day events, where he's giving a TED Talk and then flashing back to the past from his perspective as a young child. So, and it's cool because he starts out, hey, you might know me from Star Trek and some of my acting appearances and the founding of the Japanese American Museum. And you might know me from that, but I'm here to tell you the story about my childhood.
Yeah, I think the hard part too for him might have been, this is how I remember things in my childhood. But then when I got to be a teenager,
he kind of,
this is how it really was. And now that I'm in my 70s or however old he is, and, looking back on it and in my current lens of being such a public figure, right? And, he's being invited to presidential speeches, and he's really been invited to a high level look at the United States. So, it kind of goes back to things that I think I've said in other podcasts. So if you read this story, or in his case, if you thought about a story of your childhood every 5 years, you get different inflections on it. You think about it different ways because you're evolving and maturing as a person.
You're looking back and with a little more broadening experiences that you've had, and you're like, okay, do I think this was good or bad, or what did I take away from it?
Right. So you're like, oh, when I was a kid, I guess
you up to who you are.
Yeah, I never noticed there was barbed wire all over, but now you think about it, you're like, what? Like, we lived in a neighborhood. Yeah, that was just barbed wire fences and guard towers everywhere. And when you're 5 years old,
constantly looking over your shoulder.
Yeah, it's like you don't notice much of that when you're 5 years old, but then when you're 18 years old, then you think back and say, why were we put there? That's when you start asking the question is why and how.
Right. I think we should take it's a good segue to talk about George's father.
Yes.
I think he was the hero of the story to at least help keep his family together. And because I think despite all the adversity that he had to keep his family safe, to, hey, we have to leave our house because the government told us to. Right. How do you explain that to your kids? How do you keep them safe? Because they were living out in LA at the time, and they had to first get moved back, go to a camp, and I think it was in California, in the San Francisco or San Fran area, somewhere out there in the desert. It was like Army base.
They moved everyone away from the coast.
Yes.
So they kind of like scooted them into the state a little bit. And then they built.
Yeah. And then it was Arkansas. Then they moved to Arkansas.
They built a bunch of spots that were in the middle of the United States.
Yes.
They just, I don't know, the government thought, let's get everyone away from the coastline. So it made it easier to, harder to communicate with Japan.
Mm-hmm. So when they move out there, that was, riding on the train for 5-6 days just to get there and trying to hold up and save his best face and best self that he could handle with around his kids who were super young at the time, and try to get them through that hardship. And with his wife, who they lived in that uncertainty time of what's going to happen next. And his wife, especially, she's like, what's going to happen to us?
Well, and everyone that was moved, they had what they could carry.
Right.
That was it. It's like, you have to literally leave your businesses, leave your homes, everything. You just have to pick up your suitcase, and that's what you get.
Right.
And there were a lot of scenes during that train ride where the kids say, "Daddy, where are we going?" And the dad says, "We're going on a vacation." Yeah, that's it. It was like,
yep.
It's like, "Oh wow, where?" And his dad says, "I'm not sure." You know, and so they do have little scenes where, people are crying and people are sad, but young George just thought they just didn't want to take an adventure.
Yeah, we're going on vacation, long vacation to a faraway place called Arkansas.
That's right.
What is it like there?
It's
well,
Arkansas.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
And they're going on a train, and to him, it was an adventure, and living every day is different, and at least they were surrounded, I guess, people that that were the same culture, and they're there for the same reasons. So okay, there's a little bit of camaraderie. There's a little bit of togetherness, but also at the same time, they just don't have. It's not their home. It's not. They don't know what's going to happen the next day. That safety and security was always something they're like, oh, okay.
Well, and later on, then it kind of flashes. There was a page that I marked out that George was giving a talk. He was invited to sit down and talk with, government politics at his older age. He's in his 70s, I think. And he says, "It was my father who bore the pain, the anguish, and the torturous experiences the most in our family. As a teenager, I had many after-dinner discussions with my father that he would just bring up again. And he'd want to talk about
we see that later on in the book.
Forced incarceration, and he wanted to talk about politics. And his dad just explained it very simply. He said, "People can do great things, George. They can come up with noble, shining ideals. But people are also fallible human beings, and we know they made a terrible mistake." So,
that's heavy.
Yeah, it's like we can do great things, but we are also capable of great mistakes.
Right. Because at one hand, you've seen Roosevelt as this great political leader and president at the time that got us through World War II and got us through the hardest times in our country and the world and part of the world's history. But then also at the same time, where he talks about, they're also fallible human beings. So he, like we said earlier, was he just ignorant to the fact that people in his country are also Japanese Americans, or was he just doing something for the greater good because he wanted that blanket of just safety?
I think part of it was, Japan attacked the United States. Yeah. So now the United States says, well, we're going to be fighting the Japanese.
Right.
So what do we do with the Japanese that are living with us?
Yeah.
And there was no time to figure out who was born here and who wasn't, and who was loyal and who wasn't. So that it was just easier to just say, all right, let's put them all in one spot that we can keep track of them.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that makes sense for a lot of things, but it probably doesn't make sense for human beings.
Right.
And so, and at that time, I mean, the entire world was at war, and you try to think, well, maybe this was an oversight, and that's what George was taking away from it. That I hope people see this as a learning experience. He doesn't want it to turn into a, because George's TED Talk actually is a good way.
Sure.
I looked up his TED Talk, and his TED Talk in 2014 that this tells the story. This is the same story. Was called "Why I Love a Country That Once Betrayed Me."
Right.
So George was able to look back on it and say, okay, I went through this, but I'm not blaming anyone. Like, I forgive the government for making this choice. Right. And
I think some of those values are what he got from his father.
Yeah. Like that's that. And I was just to say, that's the way his father was taking it. He was like, don't worry, we have to do this, and it'll play out in the end for us. But
like a great amount of like perseverance.
Yeah.
I guess, I mean, ungodly perseverance.
Right.
Because I don't know, if you were put in that situation, like that would be a hard weight to bear.
I mean, every day, that's literally putting on a brave face every day because you are surrounded by your kids.
Right.
But they moved him into just barracks. They moved him into just like really quickly thrown up houses that were, in Arkansas, which was really hot.
Yeah, Camp Rower, ROHWER.
Yeah,
Rower.
It said it was the easternmost of the 10 internment sites. So they came up with 10 relocation centers, and they were all over California, Arizona, Colorado, and then all the way out to Arkansas. And, for his family to stay together, I think his father just, started busying himself with being involved and being aware and being informed.
Right.
He became sort of the leader of the camp.
Yeah, the leader. Cool. Yeah, the leader of
the voice.
The voice of his nearby camp is the block. He was a block leader, and that was really important to him. So he could be the voice of his community and the voice of his family, and he kind of wanted that sense of helping out his community and doing something that made a difference, because that's what he felt. That's what his calling was, rather than just sitting there.
Right. And in a way, I mean, they were a lucky family, because some families were put in jail just because they were teachers or people of power, people who were running companies.
Sure.
They were put in jail.
Right.
Because they just felt like they were a little too much influence. They're a little too high in society.
Sure. The only thing he was really conflicted about is some people in his block and other blocks were actively protesting.
Yeah.
And and he doesn't blame them. He's like, they have every right to do that. Just like in this democracy that we're promised, we can advocate for that. But at the same time, the rules that we're faced with and we're trying to incur favor, people are getting pulled away. People are getting mistreated because of speaking.
Yeah. Well, and then you have to, that's what this book was really doing for me, was like, okay, you have to constantly make choices.
Yes.
Like, how far do you want to push this, and how much do you want to protest? And, I think the dad realized if he was protesting and they took him to jail, that he just didn't know how his family, his wife, 3 kids, like, he just didn't know how they would do. So he did hold his tongue at a few times. And I know a lot of people who really praise being a protester might say, well, he shouldn't have held his tongue. But I mean, it's just hard to read stories like this. Like, what would you do?
Right. Also, like, his mother was the kindest person, and what was the one thing she wanted to take from home all the way to Arkansas?
Like, what do you put in your suitcase?
A sewing machine. That sewing machine had to be a pretty hefty weight to it.
In the 40s.
Like, they had to be a good 20 pounds, something like that.
Like, even the typewriters of that day was like, oh my gosh.
Right. And so, because her point was like, hey, I want to make sure my kids are clothed.
Right.
And, they have that opportunity, because who knows what's going to happen on the road to us. And I wanted
and she ended up sewing
and
drapes
she helped,
and tablecloths.
because she wanted to make the home that they were staying at the most they could feel like home. Just to make it comfortable for all the kids. So I thought that was very admirable as well. And, something she should.
Well, that was the mom's way of making sure her family was together, was that they were, they had blankets and clothing and drapes and tablecloths and pillowcases and things. Because she did. I think they all had a feeling that they were just going to some random place. I don't think they knew the extent of it, and they didn't really realize just how basic it was going to be.
Oh yeah, it says, you knew this was written. I know, but the children hate new clothing. It's like, okay. So that was kind of one of the lighter points, but that was really interesting to read.
So later on, they said that people who were already in the military by the time of Pearl Harbor, or the Japanese Americans who were already enrolled in the military, enlisted, they were required to surrender their weapons. They pulled them out of the military and they put them in jail. And they said that they just couldn't be trusted. And he said most of these young men had never set foot in Japan, and they were completely American.
Right.
And a lot of them, just presumed that, well, the emperor was, acting out of sorts. So they had no loyalty to them. And then in a really roundabout way, the United States in 1943 said, hey, we do need everyone to join the military. Everyone available.
If you,
regardless of ancestry, it says. So it doesn't matter who you are. So now Japanese Americans would be allowed to join the military.
Yeah.
So even though they were pulled from their neighborhoods and pulled from their businesses and their homes and put into internment camps, now they said, hey, you can join the military to fight for America.
Yeah, asking people who we put in camps.
Yes.
The old government, they have put them in camps. Now they're asking them to go fight and die for the country.
And that was just sort of like, all right, there's the other shoe that dropped, And this goes back to, it's good to read this story. It's good to pick up this comic because you need to realize
that's a very important line.
that's a very real situation and that's a very real choice. So they sent out, the United States government sent out and said, everyone over the age of 17 must fill out this form. And they said there was pages and pages and pages to fill out. But the questions that they had in particular was, number one, are you willing to serve in the United States Armed Forces on combat duty wherever ordered?
Yeah.
So that was that part of it. You're joining the military. Will you go anywhere we send you?
Yeah.
And then number 28 was, will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any or all attack by foreign or domestic forces, and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor or to any foreign government, power, or organization. So that's where George and his family, they wrote in no and no.
Right. And that kind of divided up the camp that they were staying at.
Yeah, because some people said, yes, I will defend the armed forces, and some said I won't. And they split them.
Yep. Absolutely. And that was really a hardship because these were people that over, the last like 6 months or whatever was a year, that they started to bond with them. They started to form a community. They started forming families with them. And to see them now get split up by that was really a crushing blow to them. They're like, okay, what's going to happen with that? His mother, they're like, what do we do?
Yeah. I was trying to compare it to other circumstances. So what they're saying is, you were born here, your parents and your grandparents maybe were from Germany.
Right.
So it's like, you're born here and you're American, and do you, break ties from swearing to the German government? And it's like, what? Like, why would I? So some people saw it as absurd. But at that time, I think they were just reaching for answers, and that's hard.
Yeah. And that's a hard time to navigate as well. And what was it? They were talking about that unit that went over there in early 1943. The 42nd Regiment Combat Team was created as a special all NEC unit. So this was like the second generation. So there was like their parents' generation. Then it was like them, like his father and mother's age,
like second born Japanese.
That's a great way.
And they put them all in one unit. So they didn't mix them in. They just made their own units out of Japanese.
Thousands of volunteers from Hawaii and intern camps on the mainland. And then it talks about them going to save another regiment that was kind of surrounded in France at the time, and it took a lot of units and men, let's say, but the 442nd was able to break through and rescue 211 men and suffered over 800 casualties.
Yeah, so the Japanese American unit saved the regular military unit. And they didn't even mention it. They were written out of the history books for a long time.
Right.
Until later, they were all given awards of service.
Yeah.
From Clinton?
He goes on. Yeah, it was the Clinton administration. Because, Truman was like, oh, you get kind of like it was their second highest honor. Then many years later, Bill Clinton upgraded them to the Congressional Medal of Honor. And he says, like, in the caption, America owes you an unbearable debt to you. Yeah. Yeah. So that was at least saying that. And that was in 2000 that happened. So,
and it was almost like every year something changed, because then again in 1944, they said that bill was passed that they allowed Japanese Americans to renounce their citizenship so that the United States would be able to deport them if they wanted to.
Right.
So it's like, if you
That's
want
what
to
his
go
mother
back,
was conflicted about.
yeah. So it's like, if you want to go back to Japan, you can. Well, then they were wondering, like, is Japan going to be better than we have here? Right. Like, America has come back on all their promises.
It's a war-torn country as it is. Like, why would we leave? I mean, it sucks for where we are right now, but imagine the more uncertainty going back to our country and seeing what new challenges we have to face.
Yeah, it split the camp again because they were going to close the camp, and they're like, all right, we're going to close the camp, so you're not going to be, you're given food every day, you're not going to be under guard, and you're not going to have this society here. You're just going to be spit back out into America and to find your way. All the houses and businesses that they had built years before were way gone, assuming. And they said, or if you want, you can go back to Japan. It's okay. We'll let you renounce your citizenship and we'll just deport you to Japan. Some of them thought it was a trick. Right. And some of them thought, well, this is now the ultimate, racial divide, is just to say, you were born here as Japanese Americans, but if you want, we'll just deport you back to Japan. And so, again, I think that was like another hard choice of, like, what is better? Do I go back to Japan, where maybe Japan was more willing at the time to, bring people in?
Because they thought they could do a prisoner trade or trade of.
Yeah, they wanted to have them as sort of a bargaining block.
Right.
I don't think they were doing. They mentioned it a little bit. I don't think it was like a prisoner. Straight, but they're like,
it was kind of alluded
to. We
could
could say, like, hey, here's America sending back 1,000. What can we get in return, kind of thing.
Yeah. And so his mother, that kind of almost divided the family.
Yeah.
Because she said, I will do this. And his father's like, what? You're going to go do that? She's like, it's better than where we are now.
Yeah.
And so she signs this paper. She starts the process. And all of a sudden, the bomb goes off. I believe that's where Hiroshima happens.
Yeah.
And they're just kind of fine. So she's already applied. She says, yes, I'm going to go back to Japan. The bomb goes off. She hears the news, that the family hears the news, and she's like, I don't want to go back there.
Well, and it was funny too, because they didn't think it was real.
Because they thought it was propaganda. Yeah.
So it's
which is wild to think about.
It's like, okay, everyone, you can go back to Japan, and then literally it's like by the way, Hiroshima's gone. So they're wondering, well, is this a trick? I mean, it was just an unsure time, right?
Yes.
I thought it was poignant that they had a lot of family over in Hiroshima too.
Right. So, yeah, they had like I think some aunts and cousins and things like that. So they did. They said, "Oh, my family lived over there," and some of them. So they are also heartbroken by that as well. So they had to have a special like immigration, I guess, lawyer.
Yeah, that he took up the case for all of them and really kept a lot of them here in America.
Yeah.
And so then they decided, all right, we are going to restart our life, and we're going to move back to Hollywood area.
Yeah.
They moved back to Skid Row to start. And it's like, that's exactly what they thought was going to happen. They were just going to be thrown in some really, sketchy place in the United States. And, again, it goes back to the resilience of, like you said, their dad and their mom, and to say, hey, the only thing that we're going to focus on is that we're together as a family, and we're going to rebuild. And George found theater, and he found being an actor. And
it was
when, a really great.
I think during in the camps, like they had like movie night or something like that, and that's where George fell in love with the cinema. It was like the silent pictures too, so you would hear all the voiceovers and things like that. That some of the residents, were telling him, and he's like, "Oh, that's really cool. I want to get into that." And but he still had that experience like later in life. It was just like, oh, okay. Is this a route that we support? And eventually his family came around to it. So he was kind of like, he was very fortunate to like find that role, and he was given like different opportunities and like musicals and things like that he could get into.
Well, and it's also, that time of American history where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was rising.
Yeah, and he got to meet him, so that he talks about that. It was like, wow,
the 60s, so it's all about equality, and like, George was right there because that's the thing too. You take your experiences from when you were younger, and then you see how you can use those and help those around you. And George was like, hey, these are things that I went through. I'm not. It's not that he was mad about it. It was just saying that, I want to make sure that people understand that, kindness is the better way to go. This is what happened. But at the same time, you need to realize that it's important that these things do happen so that we can learn from them.
Right. The play that he first got like his start in was Fly Blackbird, which was kind of in the LA Sports Arena in 81. Or no, that was 61. Sorry. 61. So that's where he kind of starts out. And eventually, he meets Martin Luther King, and they kind of talk about, getting started. And really, he struggled in Hollywood after that, getting kind of stereotyped for different roles of culture like that he was in. And it took them quite a while till he landed at the studio where I Love Lucy was filmed.
Yes.
And so it was Lucy, owned by Lucy Ball and her husband at the time. And they said, okay, hey, we got, and his agent, helped him meet Gene Roddenberry and get him kind of signed up for Star Trek. So it's kind of like a full circle moment there of, and then being part of like a multicultural like cast. Yeah, so it's a full circle moment where
I thought it was cool. Yeah, that Gene Roddenberry said that that you're going to be cast as a Pan Asian heritage, to represent that entire part of the world. So it wasn't just like you're Japanese, because in the far future, you were representing that entire part of the world. So he really liked that. I think it was for all Asian men.
Right. Yeah, I forgot he had a little bit of he talks about like a little bit of Mission Impossible in there too. So it was cool to see some pop culture references like sprinkled throughout there. But one other thing that I guess it was interesting to mention, and he kind of does it in the background sparingly throughout the book, is he does this like big interview during, I think he's in President Roosevelt's house. And he didn't want to, I guess at one time, while he was meeting Martin Luther King, he worked for like a Democratic Party or something like that. It was helping political election. And Eleanor Roosevelt comes by to thank everybody and whatnot. And he's like, I don't really want to meet. I'm okay with that. But I don't think they realized what that did to me later in life. So I was kind of sad, that's okay. But to like have that was a big moment for him, was having that big interview in his house, and just like, this was a thing that happened in history. But really all in all, he looks back and now he can be that advocate. Like he talks about his different roles and how Star Trek changed him, how his character rose up through the ranks, similar to how he, as a child, he went through a lot to get to where he was, and so did his character. And he saw him at a con, like getting to advocate as well and talk about his life and his career.
I mean, he's always the first one to stand up when he sees injustice.
Yes.
And, that's great that he has become such an influential, character himself, like social media presence, that he has an audience that he can say, hey, everyone, this is something that we need to pay attention to. And, that's sort of the dream of all activists, is to just reach as many people as you can, and just sort of shed light on things that are going well and things that aren't going well. So, and that's what this book is about, is just to say, this is a moment in history that should not be repeated, but it's also a moment that we should look at as a mistake, and what can we learn from it?
Yeah.
And like I said, it's actually sold at Scholastic Books, which is great. It's getting into the hands of kids, and the stories being told in all ages. But take a look at it, grabbed the book. It's called They Called Us Enemy, and there's a couple different printings. And is the deluxe on its way? Is that
I think so. I've seen it, IDW advertising it, and this is also a New York Times best-selling book. And he also got several awards: the American Book Award, Asian Pacific American Award for Literature for Young Adult Literature, Eisner Award for Best Reality-Based Book in 2020. So it is getting recognized as it's up there, and it's going to be an essential like graphic novel, absolutely. And so I'm really super happy that we read this book, and just to see, I didn't know too much about this part of history myself. So it was really good to get educated about that. And now I can tell my circle of friends and the people I work with, and like, this is a really good book.
Yeah.
Check this out.
I mean, it's interesting because it's not the typical comic book superhero book. Yeah. And that's what we're trying to look for, trying to see what's out there. There's all walks of life for comics. And this one, again, the illustration is spot on. The story is amazing. Right. And great story.
Yeah, if there's any like autobiographical whatever, if there's any books about different characters or iconic people in history, or somebody that really stood out that you have for us about the show, feel free to put a comment in below on a post or things like that. We would love to check it out. Definitely want to read more of these kinds of stories and explore about them. So, all right. This is another great episode of Bam Pow Comic Hour. This is Andrew Blonner
and Chris Ramos
signing off.